And then you get Lazarin's confirmation of the plague, known as a Drafa, which is 100% contagious, 100% fatal. We've talked about this is a bit more of a sci-fi disease here. But what do you think of those scenes from the two doctors and the idea that Drafa is something you can only catch if you're impure?
I mean, there's obvious parallels with diseases in
Mm,
the real world, non-fictional diseases. Uh, this isn't something that is recent or uncommon throughout history. Infectious diseases, or in fact, many even diseases that are infectious, have had a story of morality attached to them. I think when people in an epidemic, there are the people who are afflicted with the disease, who have the disease, who are infected, and then there are people who don't have the disease. Whether those people are immune, or whether they are just not yet infected, there's a distinct two different groups of people there, and fear of being infected, or of suffering from a disease or catching it from somebody else, can make people behave in very bad ways.
mm,
And one of those ways is to apply um, prejudice against the people who are afflicted rather than empathy. Which means, and also in times of fear and on certain circumstances, especially if your daily life is disrupted, people can look to you know, superstitions. They can develop um, uh, conspiracy theories about things. When we've seen
mm.
this all with COVID.
Yeah.
But in terms of assigning morality to a disease, if one particular group of society suffers from that disease more than the rest of society, then people can demonize that group. They can spread rumors about them. If like non-factual information, basically fictional information about these people,
Mm,
and often there's a moral element to that. So, like, one of the big parallels I thought with this episode that they were trying to make, especially because of the time in which this episode was written and
mm.
aired, was AIDS.
Yes.
And HIV, and of course, obviously, there was a lot of stuff in the past and still currently, but especially in America, in an American audience, would have been very aware of AIDS. America was highly publicized. Sorry, AIDS and HIV was highly publicized in the press. There was a massive public health campaign in America. Following after that, there was also a massive public health campaign in other parts of the world. But it ended up in a situation where the American public knew more about AIDS and HIV than perhaps maybe they had known about previous diseases,
Hmm.
previous epidemics and pandemics. Um, they kind of feared it in a way that they didn't fear other diseases. I mean, there's also been always been fear around infectious diseases, but AIDS was particularly um, uh, sort of associated with the gay community, homosexual communities, specifically homosexual men, and because they were suffering from it, but they weren't the only ones suffering from it, and they weren't the only ones catching it either. But that's kind of like the sort of idea that people had in their heads. That's the sort of story that was being told
Mm.
about the narrative, and people assigned a lot of like sort of
Moral judgment,
judgment, yeah, but also like moral judgment, connected to whether or not they were homophobic or not, or what they
Mm.
thought of the gay community. So I felt like that was kind of this episode was kind of linking to that as well. So when he talks about like sin, did he say sin? Is it the degenerate?
It talks about pure and impure. That comes
Yeah.
up a lot, and morality and being immoral.
Yeah, maybe he doesn't
Uh,
say sin, but he talks about
no.
the first people to suffer from the disease were on an island where
Mm.
that they thought that the behavior was excessive, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Which
excessive and
could mean anything. It could mean
yeah,
they were eating a lot.
yeah,
It could
but
doesn't
yeah,
necessarily mean something sexual, but do
yeah,
you know what
no,
I mean?
yeah, known for certain excesses is the word he
Yeah.
used, which suggests there's something kind of seedy about that, and therefore they almost deserved it because they're the ones that caught the disease, not the pure people. They were judged for it.
Yeah, so they were, I guess, behaving outside the bounds of what the Maghreb, not Maghreb,
Markup.
Marqueb,
Markup.
Yeah.
Marqueb. I keep going. Outside of the bounds of what the Marqueb would, I guess, be traditionally deemed as socially or morally acceptable.
Mm,
I mean, all of this is like culturally constructed. What
Mm.
you deem to be moral is very much culturally constructed, and what you think to be immoral is also very culturally constructed. So, um, I'm not. There was no real evidence the Marquette in the island were doing anything bad. It's just that
no.
that's what the rest of their society thought. So, And the illness could have come in many different ways,
Yeah.
but if you can assign it to a particular behavior, people like the diseases to be linked to behaviors.
Yeah.
And it's not normally the behavior that's actually spreading the disease.
Mm.
It's normally some other kind of behavior that is happening simultaneously at the same time, but may not necessarily be spreading the disease. So like we know that, any type of sex can spread HIV, any type of
Mm.
penetrative sex. But people at the time in the 80s and early 90s were prescribing it to gay sex,
Mm.
male
And,
gay sex.
Yeah.
and I think a lot
That's
of
not,
that
you know,
was not only a cultural construct, but a religious construct, and
yeah,
in the fact that it's particularly with AIDS, and the Black Death too, is that the religious community were very uh, were very participant in demonizing gays and demonizing the homophobic community, and by extension the theater community, particularly in America, in New York, and in London, where my older sister and my brother actually lived through that and worked with people and were friends with people who contracted HIV and AIDS and died. And that particular theatre community, because there was a large gay community within that community, were persecuted and demonized by religious groups who saw them as impure or dirty or immoral. And you can apply that to the Markham situation, as well. But I think it's important to also distinct that the people themselves who were suffering didn't think they were being punished. That was a religious construct or cultural construct created
Mm.
to kind of demonize them. So it's in that way. And in the Black Death, the people who were getting Black Death did believe that they were being punished by God.
Yeah.
They did think it was their fault, for whatever they did. So it's interesting that JMS is drawing on these, but you also have to be quite careful when you're talking about them as well, I
Yeah,
think.
absolutely. And I think there's that. Oh, and then obviously they talk about the idea that, yeah, in the Black Death, people kill cats because they thought they were the witches, they're the familiars of the devil, but because the cats are the ones stopping the fleas and the
Yeah.
rats, which obviously spread the disease in the first place. And you see in modern with COVID, the idea, the conspiracy theories around the vaccinations and stuff, and actually going to get 5G in your body and all these weird random conspiracy theories coming up, which is almost like a very 21st century reaction to this kind of hysteria over what's
Mm.
happening. And I'm not going to put anything in my body, even though that actually is going to save my life potentially, but also save other lives as well. And that kind of goes out the window, and fear plays a part of that. And I
yeah. Like,
think, yeah, go on.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think that's what plays into this one, and that's how it spreads because people are afraid. They're afraid to be judged as immoral, so therefore they don't speak up. And of course, by that point, it's spread so far, and they can't stop it.
I also think it's interesting. Obviously, this is the writer's decision, and I don't necessarily criticize him for this. But I think it's interesting the specific diseases that Stephen mentions later in the episode, which obviously this sci-fi disease in Babylon 5 is being paralleled with, is being
Mm.
likened to. Mentions Black Death and AIDS. And it's interesting because those are two big pandemics that that I think are very well known to the American
Mm.
public, and are in popular imagination. And now AIDS obviously is a recent one. So it's more recent, it's within living memory. It hasn't ended. There's still an AIDS pandemic out there. There's still people suffering from AIDS and HIV, living with AIDS and HIV.
Hmm.
We have better treatments now, so people can live successful, happy lives. But it's still out there, it's still something that it affects the human population. The Black Death is just this historical event that just completely decimated parts of Europe and changed social, political, economic systems, in that area for centuries. But it's not the only pandemic in history, and there's
Mm.
lots of pandemics that have been forgotten. And
Mm.
I keep banging on about it, but like no one ever mentions the 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed as many, if not more, people than the Black Death worldwide. So it I do think there's a problem here with like consistently comparing
Yeah.
one pandemic to pandemics that are in the popular imagination. I mean, there's and all pandemics are kind of unique in their own way, in their own situation. And the problem with like learning the lessons of the past, I mean, historians do that. They learn the lessons from the past to try and apply them to the future or to the current time to try and deal with problems now. But pandemics are often quite unique, and learning lessons of the past means that you're kind of ignoring historical or evident scientific specificity, and so I thought it was interesting that as soon as Stephen mentioned that, I kind of just rolled my eyes. I was like, yeah, that's because that's what the American public will know. They'll know about the Black Death and they'll know about AIDS, Whereas in America, like the 1918 influenza pandemic had a much bigger effect within a short space of time. The Black Death didn't have an effect
Yeah, of course.
like that, So I think that there's also worth noting, like, who is this episode being aimed at, and what are the lessons that the Babylon 5 writers are trying to tell the American public. And so I think they are trying to make a point about AIDS there. They're trying to show that empathy and understanding and support is the way forward when dealing with people suffering in a pandemic, not prejudice or discrimination or rumors or, paranoia or sort of violence, was what happens later on in the episode.
Yeah.
The one line that jumped at me when you were just talking about that, Clara, is I didn't know similarity was required for the exercise of compassion. Yeah. And that really, that line literally encapsulates for me what the writers were trying to say throughout the episode, is that no matter race or species or gender or sexual orientation, the disease doesn't care, and B, we are required, just being human beings, to help people. And I think for me, that's the message that I think is coming through on this episode.